So, welcome to the second Liturgy Symposium of the spring semester 2018. My name is Teresa Berger. I convene the program in liturgical studies here at the ISM and teach liturgical studies at the Divinity School and the Institute, together with my two colleagues, Professors Brian Spinks and Professor Melanie Ross. It is my privilege to introduce our speaker for today, Professor Claudio, and I can do this, Carvalhaes, who is Professor of Worship at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. He's also an activist, a theologian, a minister, a musician, in other words, what we here at ISM call a very ISM-y person. A native of Brazil, Claudio earned a first master's degree at the Methodist University of Sao Paulo, and then a Master of Divinity from the Independent Presbyterian Theological Seminary, also in Sao Paulo. He completed a PhD in Liturgy and Theology at Union Theological Seminary in 2007, working especially with Janet Walton, who actually gave the Kavanaugh lectures here at the ISM in 2005. Claudio has published widely, both in his native Brazilian context and also in the English-speaking world. I lift up in particular his 2013 book, Eucharist and Globalization, Redrawing the Borders of Eucharistic Hospitality, and his edited volume, Liturgy in Post-Colonial Perspectives, in the Post-Colonialism and Religion series. And he has a couple of upcoming books. In the interest of time, I will simply say that he has also authored chapters in more than 25 edited volumes and more than 50 articles. In his presentation today, he will speak about liturgical liberation theology, and I ask you to please join me in welcoming him to the ISM.
Good afternoon. Boa tarde. It's such a joy to be here, to see good friends and people here that I haven't seen for a while. And my special thanks to Professor Troy Messenger, who came all the way from Union to be here. Thank you, Troy, for being here. We are teaching this class, Worship and the Arts, this semester. It's been a joy to teach with Professor Messenger. I'm so grateful to be here and very much grateful to all your invitation. I love the way in which Yale is leading the way for the liturgical field in so many ways. And we are all blessed by the work that you all do here. My love to all of the students and the teachers, whom some of them are my friends, and especially to Professors Spinks, Berger, and Ross for what you do here, and also in the memory of Professor Aidan Kavanaugh, who I'm going to use a little bit today. So I bless you all for what you do here. So for me, it's a great opportunity to actually share some of my first attempts to develop more systematically what I'm calling then a liturgical liberation theology. In this attempt, I will be grateful for your comments, suggestions, insults, and so I can move forward. In this oral presentation, I'm not quoting almost anybody so that it can flow more smoothly. But there is a larger article who's a project, a part of a book project that is coming out, and we'll have it all available. The pictures that you're going to see here, all of them are from a Brazilian artist called Cândido Portinari. Theologian and biblicist José Comblan tells a story about a peasant in Brazil who went to church every Sunday and complained that all of the biblical and liturgical texts had nothing to do with them, but instead he gave all reason to the priest. His complaints include us all. And I wonder how much the texts that we use serve more to the tradition rather than to the people, the poor. How much it serves more a certain middle upper class church rather than the poor. And how our hoped neutral texts, choices, cannot go anywhere without clear social markers, public interests in race, sex, class, gender, and culture, as if our choices are only faithful to God alone. Professor James Cone reminds us that theology starts where it hurts, and that has impacted me deeply. And I think, too, that liturgy starts where it hurts. I have been a shoe-shining boy at the age of 8, and I have been in the shadow of societies. And it was this little Presbyterian church congregation in São Paulo that supported my family, gave me food, shelter, stories, songs, Bible texts, strength, and imagination to keep going. They shed a light on my life. Later on, it was liberation theology that became not only a choice within the theology's vast menu, but a way of survival. A theology that spoke to my situation and to many of the excluded people in Latin America. Now, having come this far by grace, I have learned that unless I continue to hear the suffering of those who are hurting from the worst places of our world, I cannot do theology, I cannot sing a song, I cannot partake the meal, I cannot praise or pray. In order to continue in this path, we have to follow people and movements that feed the love for the poor. Fundamentally, we must continue to follow Jesus Christ, who lived his life as an immigrant and refugee and said, "For I was hungry and you gave me food." We must follow the Hebrew Bible or the Proverbs that says, "Speak out for those who cannot speak, for the rights of all the destitute, defend the rights of the poor and needy." We cannot afford any work without being in the flow of the social movements and thinkers doing work of intersectionality, of ecology, race, class, gender, sexuality, and religion today. This intersectionality demands us liturgical theologians or any theologian to engage in processes of many dialogues that go beyond one's field and venture into other fundamental sources for new forms of liberation, for new ways of liberation theologies, and for our case today toward a liturgical liberation theology. So I begin by placing myself in what Don Sellers calls the liberationist moral and political critiques of Christian liturgy, and also what he says, the ambiguity of liturgical formation, continuing to press what, again, he affirms, the liturgical theology when it fails to acknowledge hidden power issues and the malformative histories of practice. Who and whose histories? So now, quest for methodology. The quest for liturgy is not only how we see the field, but primarily how we see, feel, and think the world. The way we see, feel the world shape our intellectual work and our agendas, interests, and commitments. Brazilian Catholic liturgical theologian Ione Boist says that the very question of our scholarship defines our path, our methodos, our methodologies. Our research and methodologies show where we are positioned. Jonathan Z. Smith says that rituals orient our bodies and make us pay attention. My work then follows Smith as it hopes to ritualize ways that help us to pay attention to the poor. Professor Brian Spinks makes it clear in his article, Imagining the Past, Historical Methodologies and Liturgy Study, that the way we imagine the past is mediated to a certain degree by our present views and concerns, both conscious and unconscious. The past is always reconstructed through the lenses of the present. If the past is reconstructed through the lenses of the present, it doesn't matter how we see the world today. The liturgical field often has its nose turned to inside of the discipline. Liturgy explains by liturgy and can only be juxtaposed by liturgical things. Fidelities to Christian denominations play a fundamental role in current liturgical historical research, and that's why sometimes it's so difficult to deal with intellectual differences within our fields. We have fences erected in all places for the good of neighborhood. When somebody or something comes out of a denominational site a little bit off of the liturgical scholarship, we tend to feel attacked, as our personal beliefs feel to be in danger. And that's because rituals hit much closer, seems like it. The idea that one is either in or out of the circle of truth reflects the passive-aggressive forms of behavior we sometimes have in the field. Perhaps worse than theological legalism is liturgical legalism. Ritual actions hold the very edifice upon which everything in the Christian building lie upon, and due to that, the claims of religious rituals are kept in high standards, so they will not be challenged or put to historical, socioeconomic, gender, racial, sexual, class tests, or else. No wonder we have in this field the known joke, right? I don't know if you have heard. What is the difference between a liturgist and a terrorist? And the difference is that you can negotiate with the terrorist. In the liturgical field, the stakes are always very high, and the consequence of dissent can be literally disastrous. Nonetheless, we must continue engaging tradition through ruptures and continuations, since faithfulness and betrayal are both part of what tradition entails. Sometimes the only way to be faithful to tradition is to betray it, so we can continue. That is to say that betrayal is at the heart of the methodological concern for the survival of liturgical theology. Some small and some big changes are already occurring in the field. The whole vast work of the women entails a betrayal to the former ways of thinking liturgy. And as Nathan Mitchell's book, Meeting Mystery, for instance, is another betrayal that says that liturgy is worldly, thus betraying the notion that liturgy can only be explained by liturgy. The Conference on Liturgy Imagined Past, done here at Yale in 2014, did offer a window into the change happening in the historical approach of the field. Martin Jean says that in regards to the methodology of the conference, it probed the impact of important shifts in historiography, for example, the turns to social history and gender history, on the work of historians of liturgy and how they imagine and display the past. This is a fantastic turn, and this move has to continue, as I hope the social turn will be extended towards histories of racism, histories of homophobia, histories of class divisions, and histories of those living in the margins of our own history. So far, the mirror of our historiography, as Martin Jean mentioned, can mostly show our own selves in reflection. So it is time for us to show the poor, the black, the Latinx, the queer, the disabled, all of them picked up by liturgical history, so we can see them as truly who they are, our own, playing a fundamental part of our own mirror. As we move forward, it becomes clear the liturgical history cannot afford doing history without the poor. One of our tasks is exactly this, to read the history of Christianity as a history of the poor under the colonial project. The absence of colonized people in liturgical histories makes the Christian faith an imperial faith only, just as the absence of the women turns Christianity into a patriarchal project. Mary Collins, our very Teresa Berger, Kathleen Corley, Janet Walton, Marjorie Proctor Smith, Melanie Ross, and many others have shown so clearly this truth. But then the lack of black bodies and slavery in the history of our liturgical theology shows Christianity as a white supremacy project. Not knowing the history of our own liturgical theology shows Christianity as something that seems like it is apart from the marginalized groups of history when it stays only in the golden path of the global north. If it stays only there, it shows a commitment to a higher class ruling the rest of the world. In the same way, not knowing the ritual ways of the marginalized groups make us think that the only pattern within the liturgical history is a somewhat fixed order, and the consequence is a scholarly dismissal of a vast majority of Christians who does not follow this one fixed order. As we know, the readings of history just over 500 years have often been done by the north of the globe, and these readings have rendered theological assessments of liturgical theology subsumed to the rules of the prayer and beliefs of a certain people in historical local contexts that were turned into universal laws that the whole world now must follow. We must continue the social turn and also propose, that I also propose in liturgy and post-colonialism. The liturgical field needs to expand its theoretical possibilities and engage sources and writers that are not into the self-enclosed global north pantheon of the field. Reading from the margins entails a different commitment and conversation with the margins where we hear different voices. I teach in a course on liturgical theology, and it's so hard to find diversity. We do need to diversify. We need new eyes. We need new ears. We need new bodies to see, to listen, to feel differently. The way we see our present matters not only in how we see our past, but also in the historical, theological, and liturgical sources and the interpretations that we choose. In the histories of the south of the globe, in the 500 years, liturgy was indeed a strong weapon of mass destruction in sustaining the coloniality of power of European centers. In truth, the liturgical field has not grappled enough with the whole advent of massacres of colonization and the harm done by and through our liturgies. The work of Martinique thinker Aimé Césaire can help us here. Césaire says that the Europeans' full engagement with the Holocaust only happens because the tragedy and the crime of the Holocaust happened against the white man, as the humiliation of the white man, something only reserved until that point for excluded people. Besides Césaire's naive absence of a fundamental concept that Hitler never considered Jews proper Aryan whites, his commentary rings a bell when one considers how the flagellation and killings of entire populations of the south of the world is never considered in most theology and much less in liturgical studies. There is no intention here to say that we should not engage with the Shoah, quite the opposite. We have learned that we must engage the Shoah in liturgies, but we also must engage other sorrows too, other crimes, other projects of the South to those who are on the margins of the world. So Césaire reminds us of the conscious and unconscious ways we do not deal with the south of the globe or the marginalized. How those living below the line of the equator or below the line of a certain amount of money, they and their disasters and their catastrophes are never in the imagination of the liturgical past. There is a demand for us liturgists to do more with the liturgy of the Kristallnacht and more Kristallnacht in relation to the colonization of other people's lands, the defacing of other people's identity, the slavery of Africans, and the massive killings of indigenous people. Unless these histories are told both from the violent destructions of Christianity to the ways in which some forms of Christianity have also become the only organizing space of protection for indigenous and quilombola slave descents in the South, This dynamics of how the liturgy was a weapon of destruction, but also the ways in which the liturgy was also a safe haven for some people, needs to make us engage so that we will not be only limiting ourselves within the obscure historical moments and Euro-American history of our liturgy's so insufficient past. We can go somewhere in Europe, in somewhere of obscure time, and develop a whole book, but we cannot pay attention to the black people in this country, to the indigenous people everywhere. Instead, assessing these many histories, we can understand our present better and see how neo-colonialism continues to hold sway of people's lands, natural, religious, and cultural sources, owning governments and our own imaginaries. By assessing the colonial histories, we can understand that coloniality is at the stake of our days and see how liturgy continued to be, in many ways, a colonial project, a white supremacy organism that served only to sustain a certain class of people. As I mentioned in Liturgy and Post-Colonialism, one of the key questions for us to wrestle with is what Brazilian Alfredo Bossi said. He said that it is the angle and the practice and the universalizing discourses of religion, the idea of totality and the day-to-day life cut by economic division and oppressive hierarchies of power marked by our cultum, our worship, that the supine models of our liturgical being, our cultus, is a result of dialectic process, as colonization also entails dialectic process in dealing with power differentiators and complex compositions of religion, economics, and racial figures. For instance, the worship space where we offer our worship to God anywhere is always already a private space. How do we deal with that, with the notion that God is the owner of the land? If you talk about our eschatology, it's not about time, it's about space only, also. If we are to take the eschatological aspect of our faith seriously, we must have to pay attention to space. Who owns the land? Who has access to it? Who makes the decisions? Who is in the hierarchical structures? Can the homeless sleep in the premises of our worship spaces? Can these religious places become a shelter, a home? Is the worship a place of one voice of the church? Or is it also a place for the voices of those who are with us and those who are coming by shifting, transforming, changing our very stable notion of identity? Whose voice can speak in our liturgies? We can also say, who can the poor speak in our liturgies? Can the subaltern speak in our liturgies? Can the worship be a place with a plethora of voices that makes a cacophony and even unintelligible theologies? Our voices are plural, as we are plural, with voices from those who came before us, voices who are still coming. From the voices of the marginalized, can the worship space be a place that demands racial justice? How do we undo those structures? Because in one word, everything is at stake at our liturgies. Not only the liturgy of the church, the world is at stake at our worship services. And those questions are questions for the liturgical liberation theologians to ask. The worship space is a privileged space as it engages identity, struggles, and our ways of being. In the worship space, we open a small window into what life is and what life should be, as Professor Sellier says. But to understand the inside of the worship space, we need to understand the outside of the cultic space. The liturgical field has repeatedly said that liturgy can only be understood by liturgy, and that, the Eucharist can explain the church, and this church can explain the Eucharist. The theological of the Christian rites can only be explained by the tradition shaped by our willingness to accept its authority. Its own symbols only juxtaposed with each other, bath with gathering, word with meal, and so on. This is actually key for our understanding of our liturgical liberation theology, because right here I'm proposing that we must bring the whole world inside of this very space, the space of our worship. The idea is to understand worship space as the world of God and not only the world of the church. In this way, it is important to ask what is in our culture that determine who we are, what make of this world, so that we can know what is worship and who are there. In this way, our historical work matters since it sheds light or shadows in those issues of our present time and the people that are related to it. In the background of this liturgical liberation theology, I hope we will hear an attempt to juxtapose race with word, immigration with birth, nation-state with gathering, health care with sending forth. The specifics of this relation will come in a future work that I'm doing, but for now I just wanted to work on the methodological sense of this liturgical liberation theology. So a liturgical liberation theology should not come as a shock. There are plenty of sources in the early Christian church that demand us to care for the poor, to attend the poor, and to challenge the richness and the gold of how some churches have cared more to embellish the altar with gold rather than care for the poor. The key work of Tissa Balarusia, the Eucharist and Human Liberation, was perhaps the first liturgical liberation theology avant la lettre. And Brazilian feminist liturgy Catholic Jan Buist was the first person to actually work close to what I'm calling a liturgical liberation theology. Nathan Mitchell keeps repeating in his book, Meeting Mystery, that liturgical discourse must inevitably give way to the body, to the embodied action of ethical performance. The human body is the basic site of liturgy, he says. In order to do that, we must start, and here's where we start, our liturgical theology where it hurts. Literally in the body. We begin with hungry bodies, empty bellies, bodies exploited in every way, economically, racially, politically, sexually, socially, bodies turned into disposable things, objects, bodies whose value is not in simple existence, but rather taken as consumeristic qualities, bodies excluded from the common good, living under bridges or old cars or scattered around highways in no real shelter, sick bodies without care of assistance, body whose mental health is diminished and its conditions or possibilities are no more than abandonment and carelessness, bodies of people living in depression, in desperate conditions, black bodies in public jails, brown bodies in private jails, white bodies in both jails, bodies of affliction, bodies of pain, body whose value lies in the exchange of sexual goods, bodies of families trying to make it with very little, under the pressure of economic loss, living increasingly within the bare bones of what is left just to keep breathing. Bodies used by the state, bodies violated by the state, bodies between necropolitics and biopower, with the state determining whose are to live and who are to die. How are we to respond to those bodies in our liturgies, if they are there? I had this worship that I did at Union, and one way of relating to that, I put the Eucharistic table on the ground. We did on the ground. And then I got the body, and instead of working with the pristine sense of the body, I smashed the body, started to pound the body and name all of those pains into the body. And it was a way of actually realizing the broken body of Jesus with the broken body of the people. Surely the gatherings, perhaps we do have to care for it, but it is not. I know that the worship cannot change the world. I know that. In fact, there's very little that can be done there, right? However, in all its necessary exaggerations that I'm making here, overstatements and overdetermined expectations, worship is still a very important event done throughout the world where the poor can find a place where they can rest their bodies, find sustenance, and be honored. During worship, those who are deemed garbage of the world can reclaim their dignity, hovering around death every day. The poor can be filled with life if the liturgy is life. Perhaps one simple way is to go from a symbolic meal where we said, oh, come to the feast of God, if we turn this into a real meal so the poor can eat. So that every worship space, we're going to raise the body and say, nobody will go hungry in this place. Worship is fundamentally a place of response where people respond to God's love and engage in the love of the world. In worship, the poor and excluded come hungry and wounded. Bodies marked by death go through the worship of thinking, feeling, singing, and talking about death. The death of hunger, of homelessness, of unemployment, of not having health care, of mental illness, of broken bodies of all kinds. Like the disciples who went through the fullness of Jesus' death, they were surprised by Jesus' resurrection. It is this surprise in worship that we hope every time we meet will happen. That the Holy Spirit will take our spirit of sorrow and give us a heart filled with gladness. By the sustenance of the Spirit, through death and all of the disasters of the world, we can receive and create together possibilities of new life. And that creation is the celebratory moment of worship. Worship then as the repetition of the circular movement of death and life. The fullness of Holy Friday and the possibility of Easter Sunday every time we worship. Then worship as religare, that which binds people and all realities back together. The movement of the Spirit with the body, the awakening of our conditions and possibilities. The ungrasping of our mind from ideas and concepts, fear, anger, and disconnection. Worship is the undoing of binaries, such as knowledge of God and knowledge of ourselves, immanence and transcendence, sacred and profane, human and nature, us and them. At worship, we undo those binaries, because at that place, we can have a fundamental connection between people, every people, with the earth, the animals, the cosmos, sentient and not sentient beings, all there is. When that happens, then worship is an exercise in worship, where we learn about the alienation of people from their sources and the ideologies that keep them in emotional, spiritual, and material chains. Then we figure out whose God it is that we are worshiping. In this way, worship and liberation is paramount. And that's when we can understand the El Salvador theologian Ignacio Lacuria saying, true Christian liberation is discovered and promoted in liturgy and only in liturgy. At worship, a deep solidarity arises. Care and honoring is relentless pursued. Peace and justice kiss each other. Because through ritual, as Catherine Bell says, people can make and remake their worlds. Let me spend that a little bit. Taken from the work of Aidan Kavanagh, the notion of theologia prima and theologia secunda, the primary theology and the second theology. So primary liturgy, liturgical theology says, is the common work of the people when they are worshiping God, right? The worship, the praise of God, and the liturgia, the ways the community praise God. Worship, stealing from the words of Richard Schachner, it is the showing of a doing. Life lived fully. And then secondary theology is the reasoning of life lived, the accounting of such movements, words, gestures, the writing of those actions first done, the theory of a praxis, the showing of a doing now written, an attempt to elucidate what happened during the worship. So that's why first and second liturgy, right? Theology or liturgical theology. So in some ways, this relation can be compared with liberation theology's methodology. For liberation theologians, the theology actually is the second step, since the first step is life lived by the poor. The analogy here is that I would use the worship space, whatever space that is, as a case in point of a larger community's life, a privileged space to understand the world from this local context. At primary theology lies the bodies and experiences of the people and their hurts, their pains, their hunger, their mental illness, their homelessness, worshiping God to illuminate both the primary and the secondary theology. Communities pose their environment, their struggles, their fun, their play, their desires in worship. Brazilian liturgical theologian Júlio César Adam, he analyzed Romaria da Terra, liturgy done by campesinos and landless people in Brazil, and then wrote about it later. For him, liturgy first impulse is the search for what moves people in the daily lives of the people. In moving ourselves in search of something that is lacking, liturgy entails social action within its context. Each liturgy denounces and celebrates the world. Worship, celebration, liberation cannot work separately. No service will change the world if the celebrants don't let one flow into the other, worship into the daily life and the daily life into the worship. We can't isolate the worship space only as a performance of one's holy things. Actually, the holy things are actually the outcast. The holy things are the poor. The holy things are the disfranchised, the unbeautiful. The primary theology includes what Nathan Mitchell calls the three distinct yet essentially interdependent: the liturgy of the world, the liturgy of the church, and the liturgy of the neighbor. That is one reason why a sacramental rite, he says, such as the Eucharist, can never be understood apart from economics and ethics. Now, the trinomial of lex orandi, credendi, and vivendi, the law of prayer, the law of belief, and the law of ethics, must be now expanded by another lex, a law that I'm calling now the lex ecologicus, or lex natura, which is the full relation of the living organisms to one another and to their physical surrounding. We must learn, because of our situation, we must have the lex natura as fundamental for our thinking of our theologies. We must learn with indigenous people and consider humanity more than human beings. Humanity includes animals who are living just different shades of humanity, considering the whole ecology with the flora and fauna, plants, flowers, animals, spirits, all the rivers and forests and seas, and the whole geographical world as full of God's glory as any human being. Thus, what is proposed here is for liturgical theologians to see the whole world as a worship space, as a locus theologicus, without the dichotomy of the in and the out of the worship. Worship is a collective doing of the liturgy of life that presses in on the liturgical borders of the church and which calls all liturgies to cross borders. Liturgy cannot be explained by liturgy alone anymore, but has to be challenged by the real experiences of the people. What does immigration tell of the liturgy? How do we understand the reasons of poverty in worship so we can start to act to overcome? How do we honor those defaced by the world, engage in the circular movement of mutual teachings where reality checks tradition to its validity and tradition helps sustain a much stronger sense of reality? Then worship is an action. In that light, having the whole world inside of the liturgical space and having the ritual performance as an expression of all of our dignity, a case study of our whole humanity, we can begin to understand liturgy as the real encounter with both the chaos of life and God. It is the gathering of people living at the edge of chaos, of oppression, of poverty that is always ready to devour them all at once, that we discover prayers and gestures that no theology has ever thought. At the edge of chaos, of racism and class struggles, of broken immigration systems, of sexism, a community gathers to make sense of their lives, to share in solidarity with one another's sufferings and sing their spirituals and praise songs just to make it to another week in the white supremacist U.S. At the edge of chaos, Dalits are kept in utter humiliation, but a community gathers to undo the homogeneity of the caste and social humiliation with rights of moral responsibility. Liturgy then becomes what the meaning of the word liturgy should become. That is, the full work of the people with God. Its etymological sense, the work of few people on behalf of many, doesn't have space anymore. The work of the liturgical liberation theologian is to give an account to those actions. She goes to a Black Lives Matter manifestation and comes back to her community at worship. She shares the strategies, the songs, the words, and the symbols. They talk about it, and then they add the religious sources, their liturgical symbols, their traditional songs. Now the community gain a sense of how racism works and how a Christian community can gain language and gestures to respond to it. Liturgical liberation theology is then a way of working. This worship goes through the working of the people in action, songs, movement, and gestures as a way of processing the liberation dreamed, announced, and lived through that time. Kavanagh used to say that liturgy is the doing the world the way the world was meant to be done. And that is what we do in worship. The creation of liturgies that will do the world as is meant to be done. Liturgical liberation theology is the theory, practice of worship practice theory. The liturgical liberation theologian must be present there with the people to see what arises from the people, what is necessary, how people can deal with their own hurts and pain. At worship, people will cry out for what they hope, dream, and need. They will offer and demand, search and give. They will sing their songs, and their songs will be juxtaposed with the songs of tradition. They will bring their symbols and put together with the symbols of our faith, juxtaposed with the Bible, the altar, the table, the water. They will bring their prayers, and those prayers will be added to the 2,000 years of prayers. The liturgical liberation theology must take an account of the whole bodies of the people within communities, for it is a movement of the whole body of Christ. In this way, the worship is theologia prima, and the books always to be written afterwards is theologia secunda, second theology. In the words of Otto Maduro, his book Maps for the Feast, I'd say that theologia prima is the feast and theologia secunda is the map of the feast. You celebrate first and you figure out what is it that you did afterwards. So just to finish, some of the major tenets for liberation theology can be a guiding process for us. First, in method. I have 18 points in my article, but I'm just going to have 5 for you. I know you're happy. In method, adding the lives and the experiences of the poor as main sources for our doxology, and the organizational center for our liturgical orders. The major thing, liturgy is for the people and not people for liturgy. Indifference, not accepting Euro-American context as universal claim of God's. Our liturgies will be based on local context and crossing issues of poverty, sex, gender, economy, race, and ableism, and from there we'll aim to the universal. Third, in salvation and bodies struggling for historical liberation within this world, and within one another through the consciousness of our eschatological place right now. Salvation, liberation grounded in Jesus Christ, but realized only through a plural event found in interreligious communities, being with others. The preferential option for the poor, reading the Bible from the side of the poor and insist that God clearly shows a preferential option of the poor. And fourth, historical materialism, which is fundamental to help us think the social forms of production of wealth and how the poor are absent from the financial capital. Fifth, in class struggle, which are the heart of this work and how the division of wealth affects the way church works as an identity cup holder for middle and upper classes. And consciousness, which is a way of learning about places in the world, the poor gaining a better sense of their own power, and the rich being converted towards the poor. So the liturgical space is a space of conversion. If you go to worship, you're not converted, then you've been to something else, but not a worship. Because every place where God is, you must be transformed. Liturgical theologians become organic intellectuals, grounded in their academic work and living with the poor, who are well versed in their own tradition. And aesthetics and spirituality. Liturgy is not only objectivity, but a lot of it is made of that which cannot be grasped by objective thought. We need to search for what is beautiful, for what it is that sustains life against the necropolitics and consumerism of our society. A spirituality that helps us, turns our desires to God and to one another. Concluding, if the work of the poor truly shapes the assembly and its actions, we will learn that primary theology is the movement done by the people in worship in response to God's love. People's needs, bodies, and earth hurting are paramount to our orders, worship orders. The kind of worship, it is an exercise in justice as we give God's glory. Can we all do this? Professor Lathrop asks, can the Christian liturgy really do all this? Most probably not. But we need to dream, right? We need to dream of a reality that isn't here yet. In order to anticipate this reality, we need to do some important things. First, theologians should know, if nothing else, that the only reason they have their jobs is because Christian communities worship. They should be more interested in liturgy rather than detached discourse done away from the worship spaces. At least come to chapel sometimes. For it is there that a lot of people figure out their faith. Second, we must be converted to the poor. Without this conversion, none of that will make sense. Third, as Jan Boyce says, we need to be part of worship service with the poor. So we need to move, spend time with them, learn how they worship, and follow their primary and secondary theology. Fourth, work of intersectionality of the body, class, gender, race, ableism, immigration, refugees, ecology, nuclear weapon, militarism, economics, and so on and so forth. So that we can have a much larger sense of how to do a transnational, intercultural, interreligious networks of corporeal habits and solidarities with the poor. My last page. Rituals are flesh, border crossings, events where we are bodily implicated in calling and responses. As Amon Young says, every tongue a different practice. How do we make this cacophony of voices practice to be together in solidarity? Just try. Just try. I hope the wisdom of our shared liturgical imagination can help us move towards God's full glory and a flourishing humanity, especially the poor and the earthly ecological system. May God give us